Why Media Group? The fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome to Why Media Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and while Prime Minister Mark Carney has secured his majority government very recently, well, now he has 6 upcoming federal by-elections that will determine whether the Liberals can keep their very slim majority. Now, this immediate political reality is what the Liberals are looking at when it comes to being safe for now, but what does it mean for the future? And could it even trigger a bigger question of what we're speculating that maybe perhaps Prime Minister Mark Carney will call for a general election to be able to ask for a major mandate? So now the bigger question here is that what will happen if he just, let's say, holds the 6 by-elections and what it means to secure his position for the next 3 years, as the election was back in 2025, so that he still has a good 2.5 years to go. So here you have it in terms of the bigger question is what happens once voters head back to the polls in these 6 vacant ridings for a by-election that would have to be held later this year. So here you have the 6 MPs are expected to leave the House of Commons this summer. So already resigned are Jonathan Wilkinson, who was a Liberal MP. Then there was Simon Pierre Savard Tremblay from the Bloc Québécois. And the MPs that are expected to resign very shortly, perhaps this summer, is Stephen Guilbeault of the Liberal Party. Then you have Nathaniel Erskine Smith, also a Liberal MP. Alexander Blucleris, who's an independent, a former NDP, and Cathay Wagenthal, which is a Conservative MP. And so now once MPs officially resign, the government has between 11 to 180 days to call a by-election. So when you do the majority math, you're looking at when the House, adjourned just last week. The seat count was for the Liberals 173 and the opposition combined to 169, and you have one speaker, which is a Liberal MP. So now by September, after the additional resignations, what you're looking at is Liberals at 170 and the opposition's combined at 166. Well, you need 172 to have majority. And so again, you have the Liberals in a situation where they're going to be below majority level, what the threshold is. So it's going to go back to a minority government. And so these vacancies reduce the number of sitting MPs as well as the remaining Liberals that will still be in this minority situation. And then they're going to have to work with some of the opposition parties to be able to pass bills, which is why the Liberals, few days before the House rose for the summer, they pushed through 21 bills because they had their, slim majority. And so now what happens is that this becomes very interesting because you got to take a look at these 6 vacancies, which 3 are currently Liberal held MPs that are vacating their seats. So if they, when it comes to Liberals, they only need, in terms of like a couple more to win out of the 6 by-elections to maintain their majority status. And so if they lose, let's just say all 6 races, which is not likely because those are, Liberal held, but let's just say in the case of an argument that they lose, the 6 races, Liberals would fall below majority territory, Parliament would return to a minority government dynamics, and opposition parties would gain leverage, and then they could call, a loss of confidence vote and then trigger an election. So now here is what Prime Minister Mark Carney has to maintain. He has to maintain his technical majority, even if it's a slim one. But how far is he going to go with having majority, then just close to majority and close to minority government when you're that close, when 1 or 2 MPs resigning really changes the entire dynamics. So we're going to watch what this means when it comes to the Quebec elections. 3 of the 6 vacancies are in Quebec, and the Quebec provincial election scheduled for October 5th of this year. Now, the Liberals may avoid overlapping their campaigns for a by-election to prevent voter fatigue and political complications. And so what it could be a consolidated by-election, hold all six at the same time, which is great for when it comes to, it saves costs and it simplifies the campaign planning if you have all six at the same time. So what would be the timeline of these six by-elections? Some observers are saying that it could be expected in November of 2026 or maybe December of 2026. Now, December could get cold, right? And when it's cold, then that doesn't fare well for people to come out to vote. So essentially, probably November, because then you already have the municipal elections out of the way in Ontario, which they're held on October 26th of this year. So then this would be after the municipal election, when the municipal election signs are taken off and the campaigning ends, then potentially those six by-elections could be held, or maybe even a general election where the Prime Minister might call for a majority mandate from Canadians. That's to be seen. These are all things that we're watching, of course. And I would think it's highly unlikely for it to be in December or January, or February, because it's just way too cold in Canada. It's hard for the candidate to go canvassing, meaning knocking on doors and also relying on voters to perhaps come out when there could be a thunderstorm or, sorry, a winter storm. And so, many complications if you go into those really cold, dark months of December, January, February. So it ideally could be November, so the government doesn't fall into a minority situation without having to fill those seats in. So when it comes to Prime Minister Mark Carney, this will be the fastest electoral test but since winning. I mean, he just had the three by-elections. He was able to secure those seats as well to bring him to this, majority situation that he has. But that's also after five MPs crossed the floor. So it also begs the question about, does this mean does this mean the Liberal Party is looking to have more MPs cross the floor and shy of holding potentially a general election? So you have this question that is, is the Liberal honeymoon phase over if the by-elections don't go well? That's something that we're going to be watching. And I think come July 1st, when you have the Kuzma review, well, that's going to signify things as well. If it gets renewed for 16 years, then, Prime Minister Mark Carney would be in a good position to ask for potentially a general election to say, hey, I delivered on Kuzma, I delivered on other things. And this is a time where we're also seeing the Conservatives place candidates in place in some of their key ridings. We know the Liberal Party has given Labor Day as a deadline for their MPs to meet some of their criterias to have uncontested candidates for an election. These are things that you don't naturally see if an election is 2.5 years away. So it's something to be mindful of about what could be coming up. And for the Conservatives, this is also another opportunity to show that whether the Liberals are losing momentum, if the Liberals don't do well in some of these by-elections, and of course, this is all what's taking place, and it really depends on also Quebec, because in this case, there's the Quebec provincial election on October 5th, so that could change a few things based on how that goes. But it's also a chance for the NDP to also try to gain some momentum and some influence after its staggering loss and losing party status. And so now Parliament won't collapse, obviously, if because of these vacancies, but it is politically significant because essentially it could take Prime Minister Mark Carney's government from a slim majority to potentially a minority if these by-elections are not held in enough time. And coming to provincial politics, there's a controversy, and this is the Ford Fest photo controversy that sparked debate online and in chat rooms and in the media. And this controversy centers on a photo that was released by Premier Doug Ford's office following Ford Fest, an annual Ontario PC Party event. Essentially, critics noticed apparent inconsistencies in the image, and they alleged that the crowd photo has been potentially digitally altered to make the attendance appear larger and more favorable for the incumbent government and the premier. So now this issue gained traction after image Analysts and photography experts viewed the photo and pointed out some visual irregularities. Now, Ford's office has denied any manipulation of the images to inflate the crowd size. According to the explanation provided, the photo was edited as a part of a routine image processing and stitching technique, sometimes used to improve panoramic event photos. But the government maintains that there was no intent to misrepresent attendance or create any misleading impression. So now, when it comes to experts, they're saying that, they're expressing doubts about the explanation, saying that essentially these abnormalities appear inconsistent with a standard photo correction. Their concerns were essentially when it comes to photo correction, it could just be the lighting, and that's pretty much it, and just making the photo appear more clear. But what the concerns here are, that is this like duplicated elements? Are there unusual crowd patterns? Is there visual artifacts? And sometimes indicating that more substantial editing than simple color correction. And also they said that the colors that were worn, there's a lot of blue and a lot of purple in that. So pointing out some of those concerns. So this controversy comes at a time when essentially public trust in political communication is under scrutiny, right? As much as we hear about fake news and can you trust your politicians and what are they actually doing, that's really part of the scrutiny here on this controversy. So even if, no crowd numbers were officially attached to the image, the opposition parties and critics argue that any manipulation of a political event photos can raise questions about transparency and authenticity, right? So in this case, the risk is less about whether the photo, is the way it's done, but it's more about the perception, right? So if voters believe images are being altered or, to create stronger political narrative, it can become a credibility issue. And that overshadows the event's message overall. The event's message was for the PCs, it was for the Ford Brand Fest, it was Ford Fest, which predates the PCs, Doug Ford being at the PCs. So if voters conclude that the images were enhanced to exaggerate maybe enthusiasm for, attending Ford Fest, the story becomes more about trust rather than photography techniques, right? So in politics, you have perception that is, sometimes often more important than what would be a technical explanation of a photo. And in big news, when it comes to First Nations to own stake in the Ontario nuclear reactor, this happened today, where you have 7 Ontario First Nations have signed a landmark agreement with the federal as well as the Ontario government that will give them ownership stakes in one of the new small modular reactors. And this is being built on the Darlington new nuclear project. Now, Ottawa and Queen's Park are providing up to $700 million in loan guarantees, which will be converted into equity ownership in the project. So, this agreement includes the 7 Williams Treaties First Nations. These communities are located around Lake Ontario and Lake Simcoe, east of Toronto. And this is being described as the first equity partnership involving a nuclear reactor and First Nations in Canada. Rather than receiving only what would be consultation benefits and impact payments, these communities are now becoming actual owners with long-term financial interests in these projects. Now, the investment is tied to one of the 4 planned SMRs at Darlington, which are already considering the first commercial SMR project in the G7. So Canada's leading that way. The full 4 reactor projects are expected to generate roughly 1,200 megawatts of electricity, enough to power about 1.2 million homes. So now this deal reflects what we're seeing as a broader shift towards Indigenous equity ownership, right? This is major when it comes to resource and infrastructure projects. So now you have Ottawa and Ontario that have increasingly promoted Indigenous participation through ownership stakes rather than the traditional compensation agreements that have been made with Indigenous communities throughout Canada. So these similar models are being discussed when it comes to critical minerals, energy, transmission, and infrastructure projects across Canada. So what's important in this energy story is just not just the fact that, Ontario is going to have one of the most biggest nuclear capabilities in terms of this position of what it's doing, but it's also a major economic reconciliation story for when it comes to Canadians and Indigenous communities. For decades, Indigenous communities have argued that projects built around or on or near their traditional territories should generate ownership opportunities to allow those communities to thrive. And so not just, go to them for consultation to be able to build out those projects. So now if this is successful, this model could become potentially a template for future nuclear or mining or critical mineral infrastructure projects across Canada, which is very significant and potentially reshaping how major developments are financed and approved in Canada. And Canada would be leading the way in G7 to be able to do that, and potentially other countries could follow what Canada has accomplished here. And now Ottawa also plans about 50% expansion in nuclear power. This is part of Ottawa strategy in terms of boosting nuclear generation by 50%. Up to 10 new CANDU reactors are being considered. The government wants to increase reactors exports globally, and rising demands of AI data centers is helping drive that interest. So when it comes to nuclear, it remains one of the few large scale, low emission basehold power sources. And so, as we're seeing this AI revolution that's quietly reshaping energy policy, you have government that is once focused primarily on climate goals, climate change. And if you recall, all the targets related to climate change and its goals are now realizing that the data centers require enormous amounts of reliable electricity. And so now you have nuclear power that's making its comeback because a few alternatives can meet the demands at that large of a scale. The Five Eyes warn of AI cyber threats. So now the Five Eyes Alliance include Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. Essentially, the intelligence agencies warn that there's a frontier AI could transform cyber warfare within months. Concerns extend beyond Western AI models to capabilities emerging from China and Russia. And this is a rare public warning from the alliance. Essentially, the intelligence agencies are effectively saying that AI race is moving faster than the government has anticipated. And so the next chapter and the next major cyber attack may come not from human hackers alone, but it may be from AI assisted hacking at unprecedented scale. So this is something that they're warning the governments, and this is the Five Eyes are an alliance again that came together between Canada, United States, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And today is Primary Tuesday, and we've been watching all the primaries take place these past few months and what it means for the a midterm election in the United States at the end of the year. And so today, what we're watching for is New York, Maryland, and Utah. These primaries have become national political interest and really a test. So this Tuesday's primaries are being closely watched because it's shaping American politics for 2026. The three trends that we've been seeing through primaries that have taken shape, and the one more significantly from today's, is the growing influence of New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani and the Democratic left. Not the traditional Democratic candidate, we're talking about the Democratic left. And the power that of outside money, and particularly when it comes to AI industry donors and pro-Israel groups. We've seen what's taking place when it comes to the power of outside money in American politics. And of course, watching President Trump's influence over the Republican voters heading into the 2026 midterms when it comes to him backing candidates for primaries. Now, the biggest story is whether Mayor Zohran Mamdani can translate his popularity into victories for progressive congressional candidates. So Mamdani has endorsed several left-wing challengers running against establishment Democrats. This is very significant because it's also showing what it means for the Democratic Party, the direction it's facing. You had Bernie Sanders, which is part of the left wing of the Democrats. And so this is, AOC, another one. So this is something that we're watching when it comes to Mayor Mamdani. And so now he is backing Brad Lander against challenging Dan Goldman and Dariliza Avila Chavalier against Ariano Espialat, and you have Claire Valdez against running in an open seat. So now these results will show whether Democratic Socialist in terms of politics are expanding beyond what we've seen in America when it comes to city government into Congress. So from the city of, New York City to Congress, will these left-wing Democratic Socialists move into Congress? So now they also put Mamdani on a collision course because you now have the House Democratic leadership, particularly when it comes to Hakeem Jeffries, who's backed more establishment candidates, and that is a runner-up against the non-establishment candidates that you have Mayor Mamdani back. So we're watching that for today's primaries to see what his influence really is when it comes to these primaries. And the other thing that is of note is outside money affecting politics. And this one particularly is AI money. So one of the most fascinating races in New York's 12th congressional district is to replace retiring Congressman Jerry Nadler. And the race is featuring Alex Boris, who has supports stronger AI regulation, but then you have Mika Lasher, who's backed by major establishment donors, and also Jack Solisberg, which is the grandson of President John F. Kennedy. And so you have that happening in, those runner-ups in the 12th congressional district. And what this means is that the contest has attracted millions of dollars from AI-related political groups, becoming one of the first major tests of how Silicon Valley and AI investors will influence the future of elections. This is what we're watching. And then the other outside money is the APAC influence that we've been hearing about nonstop all of last year and all of this year. So now you have several New York races that are also being tested with the power of this outside spending. Groups linked to pro-Israel lobby, APAC, have spent heavily this cycle, while progressive candidates are campaigning against what they describe as excessive outside influence in American politics. So the results could indicate whether large independent expenditures remain as effective as they were during the 2024 and the 2025 election cycles. And then there's also the Trump endorsement power when it comes to the Republican Party. So today's contest are another referendum on the strength of President Trump over the Republican Party. So you have President Trump has recently suffered just a few handful of endorsement setbacks and is trying to preserve his political influence ahead of the November midterms. Observers are watching races in South Carolina, Maryland, and Utah to see if the Republican voters continue to follow President Trump's recommendations for who they should vote for the candidate, for the Republican candidate in the primaries ahead of the midterms. So why this is all important nationally? Because here you have these primary elections. They offer an early preview of the Democratic Party's ideological direction. You have, Democrat established Democrats, and then you have this wing of the party that is more far left. And then you have the influence of AI industry, money in politics, the continuing role of APAC and the outstanding spending they're doing to influence American politics, and as well as President Trump's grips on Republican voters and what this means for the battle of control for the US House in November's midterms. So these primaries are much more than just who wins these individual seats. They are testing who controls the future direction of American politics, whether it's going to be establishment Democrats or an insurgent progressive Democrats or traditional donors or AI billionaires, and whether President Trump remains as dominant force in the Republican politics in the midterms as he's been in the last decade in politics. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back.